Welcome to the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. This is the podcast where we work to dissect and analyze the epic, the amazing, the incredible power of storytelling and learn how to harness that power in our daily lives. I'm Gaurav.
And I'm Kevin.
Welcome to part 2 of our really interesting and epic conversation with media exec extraordinaire and author of the Basic podcast about the history of cable television, Doug Herzog. I'm really excited to dive into the second half. But before you do, Kev, I was watching this video on YouTube the other day of Denzel Washington doing this famous scene from Fences. It's a scene where his son asks him, "How come you ain't never liked me?" Right? It's a very famous scene. You've probably seen the clip before if you haven't seen the movie. In this scene, in the movie, it's a very serious scene. But he did it on stage as well. And on stage, it's a little bit more comedic, the way he's acting, the way he's playing. The audience is laughing. And I remember going through the comments on that video and seeing all these people so mad at the audience. Like, why are they laughing? Like, because they've seen the movie, and I don't know if they've seen the play, but they're like, why are they laughing? Oh, this is the problem with stage acting, right? Kind of railing against stage acting. Look at the movie. Look how serious the scene is. Why are they laughing? And I'm like, because it's being played more comedic on stage. Like, that, it's bigger and grander because that's how stage acting works, right? Because there's hugely different mediums. But here's the thing. Here's the crux of my kind of frustration with these comment sections. The comment section almost act like the audience was ruining the show. Like the audience was doing something wrong. No. There are different mediums. The story's being told different ways and you're having different reactions to it, even if the words are the same. And it comes down to this. And it's a strong belief that I've been thinking about a lot as we do this show. Your audience has absolutely no responsibility to you. And I think this is hugely important. I think a lot of creators and a lot of people forget this. They think, oh, this is a masterpiece. An audience has to love it. Oh, they have to react in this way. They don't. And this example of the scene from Fences where the audience are laughing at the stage, I think about how different it would be if people watched the stage first and then watched the movie and be like, oh, why is it so serious? I saw it on stage. It's funny, right? Or vice versa. It is your responsibility as a storyteller to tell a story in a way that's going to connect with the audience. Your audience has absolutely no responsibility to you. If you want them to react to a certain way, you have to build your story around that. And I think this is hugely important. And I think it's something that we discussed on the show and something we're going to discuss more with Doug today.
Yeah, well, according to the comment section, everybody's doing everything wrong. But that's right. With part 2 of our conversation with Doug, we're going to finish up by discussing more about how creators connect with their audience on cable, the distinction between nighttime, daytime, prime time, how advertisement and creative content feed into each other on cable TV, and the legacy of cable. So let's dive back in.
The idea of, like late night as a day part and a destination, I think it's going away. I mean, it's not going away tomorrow. Like Jimmy Kimmel's going to be doing his thing as long as he wants to do it, and Jimmy Fallon, and, as long as they're making money, and they are not making the same kind of money they made 10 years ago. But I here's what I would say. When Jimmy Kimmel or Jimmy Fallon leave late night, and that's not going to be tomorrow, it's going to be a couple of years from now, I'd be curious to see if there'll be anybody that actually replaces them or those shows go away.
Yeah. I mean, it left such a lasting legacy, though. I think one show that has done it really well now is Last Week Tonight. Obviously, John Oliver has figured out that streaming
Well,
medium.
Also, he's not doing it every night, though.
Yeah.
He's doing it once a week.
Yeah.
And it's a different animal. So, the every night thing is very different than once a week. And the Emmys lump them all into one category, which I always thought was unfair. Certainly Bill Maher did. But it's a different vibe and a different energy and a different approach. That every night thing, that 4 or 5 nights a week, it's a grind. You're there every night. People expect you to be there every night. And so I think it's a little different.
Yeah, kind of going along this topic of late night a little bit more. I wonder how you would interpret the difference between late night programming versus daytime. I'm more specifically, I'm thinking about Ellen because I think a lot of times, when she would make a joke and sometimes her guest would say, this is a daytime TV show.
Well, daytime is, there are different sort of standards. Daytime is
Mm.
for women generally, like that's who the audience for that show is predominantly. It's targeting women at home, right? And there's a different, prime time was reserved, for family viewing. And that's where, cable really, in its storytelling, as it evolved, particularly with both comedies, like on Comedy Central and scripted fare on places like FX and USA Network and TNT, et cetera, they started doing edgier stuff that the networks wouldn't do. Now, that was for two reasons. There was an opportunity because the networks weren't doing it and people, wanted it. And also they were not governed by the FCC, right? So, the FCC has standards of things you can and cannot do for all hours of the day. Cable is not part of the FCC. They are not governed by the FCC. So we actually could do whatever we wanted. We could have done even what Showtime and HBO were doing in terms of pay TV and really over the top in terms of graphic violence, nudity. The difference is we were ad supported. So the truth is, in basic cable, we could do whatever we wanted and whatever we felt comfortable with, as long as we could sell it. Right. So if the advertisers wouldn't buy it, then we couldn't sell it. So, so there was a line that we weren't going to cross because advertisers were not going to buy nudity. They weren't going to buy, still not, graphic violence. They're not, et cetera, et cetera. So, South Park is a great example. South Park, very edgy. Maybe, at the time, certainly when it came on Comedy Central, I tell people back then, the edgiest things on television were maybe The Simpsons or a sitcom named Married with Children, or Beavis and Butthead. That was it. So South Park was, broke down so many walls and started doing things that nobody had ever done. And a lot of advertisers did not want to be a part of that. But there were advertisers that did because they knew it was reaching a very specific audience, young men. And those advertisers, sneaker companies, soft drink companies, the movie studios, they would pay 3 times, 4 times what it took to get into the show. So that's how that worked.
Interesting. And with that in mind, the idea that the content has to be shown in collaboration with the ads, how would ad or the, I guess, plan of getting certain types of ad, would that affect the process of actually creating the show?
Of course, yeah, still does. And, MTV started as a music channel. And then we very much, I'd say, kind of evolved into what I would call a lifestyle channel, right? Which was a channel for young people with a music foundation. But, as I used to say, there was that time when MTV was just raging where I said all roads used to come through MTV. Everybody wanted to be on MTV. Politicians, Bill Clinton, George Bush, supermodels, athletes. Just everybody wanted part of that heat and wanted part of the platform. So, at some point, our sales guys came to us and said, we could really, if we could do something like sports oriented, we could really sell that. We have a lot of advertisers looking for sports. So we started MTV Sports and MTV Rock and Jock and all that stuff. And we had advertisers coming to us going, hey, we would like, apparel companies. Like, if you guys would do something with fashion, we'd be really excited about that. So we created House of Style. So, so those were born out of, kind of commercial aspirations, but we always went a long way to make sure if we were doing it, it felt like MTV and it felt appropriate for MTV and we weren't faking it and we weren't giving the audience something they didn't want. And I think, for the most part, we did a good job.
Well, I mean, that goes back to the importance of brand building in this era, right? Because if you lose the trust of your audience, that's it. That when you put yourself on the limb.
That's exactly right. That was number one, and that was the most important thing to us, was to meet the audience expectations, to exceed their expectations, to make them feel like we were the place for them, and not that we were, we tried not to talk down to them. We tried to talk with them, not at them, and make them feel like they were part of it.
Did you have any issues with audiences? I think aging. Did you have people pretty much age in and out of MTV, or were you?
Well, we decided early on that we weren't going to be Rolling Stone. Rolling Stone magazine made a decision early on to grow old with their audience, right? They kept on putting those 60s, 70s rock stars on the cover, and they stayed with that audience that was getting older, that had first picked up Rolling Stone in the late 60s as a 19 or 20 or 21-year-old, and then 20 years later in the 80s they were still reading it. we made the decision that we wanted to stay focused on a young audience. Now that has changed. They're no longer focused on that. I think the average age of the MTV viewer is like probably over 40. But, in the heyday, from 1981 when it launched, certainly through the early 2000s for sure, it was all about, staying focused. And so if something was on MTV for 5, 6, 7 years, that was long. And, at a certain point, it came time to turn that over. And because the audience was turning over all the time. The Real World stayed on MTV for 20 plus years because they changed the cast every year, every season. So it always changed. It always stayed relevant. It always stayed in step with, the young audience. But, music comes and goes, grunge comes and goes, heavy metal comes and goes, hip hop comes and goes. So, you learn to kind of evolve, roll the punches, and keep looking forward.
How did you approach that? Because that's a very conscious decision, but it's also very difficult to maintain. We see this with platforms. Like I think Instagram's having this issue where it's aging with its audience of aging out. How did you maintain that?
Well, it's hard, and at some point,
Mhm.
we ran out of steam, right? And what really took the wind out of MTV sales was ultimately the internet, right? And the idea that there started to be new places for the audience to go and find things to do, and that's not necessarily MTV's fault. That's it's the way the world. Like I said, nothing lasts forever. But for a very long time, we just stayed very focused on it, and till the point where the world kind of changed on us, and it became much harder. I think to your generation, MTV does not have this. You look at MTV in a very different way. It's almost like a legend versus a real thing. Whereas I'm, if you're over 45, you look at MTV a very different way. That's something you grew up with. That was something that was a big part of your life. It's where you spent a lot of time, but you probably don't watch it anymore.
Throughout these 4 decades where you've worked in cable, from the 1980s well over to 2020, do you notice kind of distinct themes across each decade, or it can be decade or clear cutoff points where the focus of this medium in general becomes different?
The 80s were the go grow years, right? The 90s were the, finding your footing and really stepping on the gas years.
Mm.
The early 2000s was the internet starting to hover and make its, way into the ecosystem. And then, the 2010s was all about the advent of streaming. And that was the biggest change to come in the face of cable, and something they didn't really know how to deal with. And, look, I find it interesting. And one of the reasons I did the podcast, movies are still here. It's changed a lot, but movies are still here. Television's still here, never going away, right? How we watch it, and that's all continues to evolve, but, sort of TV style programming. Radio still hanging on somehow. Podcasting's helped,
Yeah.
but still here, right? Cable, I think, is going away. You guys are never going to be cable subscribers. You never have been. I'm assuming. Maybe not. But if you are, you're rare for young people. Cable penetration drops every year. I forget where we are now, but we're way down. They I think they're under 50 million homes at this point. And, it's hard to see what now happens to what used to be cable television. I also think these brands are withering, right? The MTV's withering, Comedy Central's withering, Nickelodeon's withering, USA, TNT, all those great cable brands. ESPN is trying to figure out who they're going to be, like maybe going to get spun off. Same with CNN. Now those networks are coming at the world a little different because it's news and sports, which is a slightly different category. CNN was, if you'd asked me 8 years ago, 10 years ago, what's the future of CNN? I would have said maybe dead by now, because at the time cable was starting to slide. Their viewership the penetration was going like this. The age of the viewer was going like this. And then Donald Trump came along, and he basically reinvented cable television. And they got a lifeline, through him in the 2016 election. And, they're as strong as they've been in quite some time. So we'll see what happens.
Do you think that stays consistent, or eventually that's going to wear off again, where politics isn't going to be as exciting and interesting and fun almost to watch, and people are going to start cutting away?
Donald Trump will, at some point, go away. But I think he has now ushered in this era of sort of performative politics. Donald Trump brought like a wrestling mentality to politics. He's playing the heel, the bad guy, depending on how you feel about him. And we're not talking about the issues anymore. We're talking about all this performative stuff and woke and, just stuff that I think the American people, they want to talk about and scream about all day, but, they're no longer talking about the issues, which is the, sort of less interesting, boring stuff. And so now you have a lot of candidates who are trying to be Trump and use Trump tactics to get attention, because by drawing attention to yourself and doing something goofy, we know this from MTV and Spring Break, the cameras will turn to you. And so I don't know. I think there's, we'll see where it goes once the Trump era ends, but we'll see. We'll see. They seem to like this stuff. The American public apparently can't get enough of it. And they like these performative politics. We'll see where that goes in the next 10 years.
It's funny too, because that's one of the things as politics becomes more performative, and it's not just these cable news that's become more entertaining, had their heyday. Political comedy has had an amazing last few years, right? And it's really this idea with giving it gravitas and giving it a lot more intrigue recently because of this kind of hilarious world.
Well, it's political comedies. What I used to think was the problem with political comedy is like not everybody got the joke because not everybody paid that much attention. But that's changed. Now you just can't avoid it. It's everywhere, and so the references are pretty global and pretty broad. And so you can go on and make jokes about whoever, and people are going to understand what you're talking about, which is not necessarily how the world worked 20 years ago.
There is one TV show or one cable show that I continuously pay attention to, and I know you really like it, so I'd love to get kind of your read on it. Inside the NBA on TNT.
That's my favorite show.
Yeah, I didn't even watch the NBA a lot at this point, but I watched that show. A part of me watching the NBA is because I want to keep up with that show. From your perspective, why does this show work? What makes it?
That's magic. That's really, you've got four really talented personalities, four knowledgeable personalities, four guys who have, for whatever reason, a tremendous chemistry with each other.
Yeah.
Four guys with a sense of humor. And it just, it's so hard to recreate and it's so hard to build. And there's a lot of luck in all this, but my God, they are fun to watch.
Yeah.
And it's just fun. It's like being, in a private club, or a bar, or listen to some of the funniest guys talk about something you're interested in. And, it's like I said, that's magic. Like you can't draw that up. No AI program can spit that out. No amount of data and analytics can tell you to put those four guys together. That's luck and instinct and some people being smart.
Well, yeah, on that point, and I'm sure that you even then had to deal with this, and as it grew too, what was it like kind of having to balance that creative business and data elements when programming these channels?
I left formally, like I said, into 16, early 17. So the data that the cable networks and broadcast networks, now it's evolved since then, was not terribly sophisticated, and I paid attention to the research. I paid attention to whatever data I could get my hands on. It was a very, very useful tool, but I just grew up in a different era. I made my bones. I made my career on instinct and just following my instincts for better or for worse. And I was allowed to do that. People put that trust in me, and I was lucky enough to have X number of successes, that I'm associated with. But, it's like hitting a baseball, right? So for every South Park and Daily Show and Real World or whatever it is, there's like 20 that didn't work. It's like hitting a baseball. If you can do it, 3 times out of 10, you're going to the Hall of Fame. I'm more like I was like a 265 hitter with a couple of memorable hits, and got to hang around. But it's not just luck, but there's a lot of luck involved. I'll tell anybody, unless you're Michael Jordan or Steve Jobs or Oprah Winfrey or Beyonce or somebody so enormously talented, driven that they're going to get there anyway. Most of us we need to do all the things everybody tells you to do. Got to be smart, got to work hard. You got to do all, everything your teachers and your parents and your bosses tell you to do. That all counts. But at the end of the day, you also need to be a little lucky, because luck plays a part. It just does. And, you're talking to one of the luckiest guys you'll ever meet. I could not have told you that that South Park was going to run for 25 years and be this cultural, iconic thing. I didn't know. I just know I thought it was funny. I thought it would work well on Comedy Central. I thought it would get us some attention, and I wanted to make it. And then we got a little lucky.
So before Kevin asks the last question, because I know he's looking at the clock and he's my clock guy. What do you think is the lasting legacy of cable? What stories really thrive there, and how did it impact storytelling going forward?
Well, I always like to say, without cable, there'd be no reality television. There'd be no 24-hour news. And there'd be no Shark Week. I mean, really, can we live without any of those things? But the lasting legacy of cable, I think, is choice. Viewers felt for the first time like I think they had a choice. Where everything was just kind of coming at them and they really didn't have a choice. And so, look, that's led to a world where the viewer is now, people like me, who were gatekeepers and deciding what you saw. That's something that's, still exists, not in the way it does, because you don't need to talk to a guy like me anymore to make a TV show or make a movie or have people see it. The whole world's turned upside down. But yeah, I think cable's story was a story of choice and differentiation.
And Doug, we've learned so much valuable insights, so many great stories from you today. And for the closing segment of our show, we call it Suspenders. It's a segment where we ask you a fun random question that's unrelated to anything whatsoever, and you give us a random answer you feel like. Today, though, I do have one question that's a little specific to you that I've just been really curious about.
All right.
I know that, the one proudest entertainment creation you have is not anything from your cable days. It's a reggae show that you started back in Emerson College that lasted for 35 years. So tell us about that. How did you start it? What made it work? What made it last?
Wow. You did some research. I'm a big music fan, always was, even as a kid. Make a long story short, I got the opportunity as a 16-year-old to see Bob Marley perform in Kingston, Jamaica. And, reggae was something I barely knew anything about. It wasn't really that much of a thing. And I just was transfixed by him and by the music. And I got obsessed with it. And, went to college and wanted to be on the radio station. And it was pretty competitive to get on the radio station. And I was like, well, they had these weekend shows, that were sort of specialty shows. And I was like, well, maybe I should try and do a reggae show. No one's doing that. Again, trying to find that white space, go someplace where nobody else is, right? And it was also the right time. Reggae was, starting to gain some momentum and steam. And Boston, where I went to school, was a great market for it. A lot of college kids, which was really the market for reggae. Big West Indian and Jamaican community there. And I got the show on, and it kind of took off and, became a thing. And it was great. And I say that, sort of in a glib way, Daily Show, South Park, Real World, whatever it is, I can claim a part of that success. But I can't say I did it. Whereas on this little reggae show, it's like, I did that, nobody helped me. I did it. So it's the one thing I can claim as my own. And I was, and I loved it. And I was very proud of it. And I love the fact that it ran for a really long time.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. This was such an amazing conversation. We learned so much. So we really appreciate you allowing us to pick your brain.
Great to meet you guys. Thanks for having me.
Welcome back to Top Hat. This is the part of the episode where we dissect and analyze some of the key and exciting learnings we got from this week's expert storyteller. And this week, we had the amazing Doug Herzog, who was one of the essential leaders in the development of cable, including iconic brands like Comedy Central, like MTV, working on shows like The Daily Show, In the Real World, and South Park. This man was influential in the rise of cable, and he now hosts a podcast called Basic, where he discusses the unofficial history of cable. And we got to dive in and talk about the storytelling behind cable, the things that cable unlocked. Kev, what did you think of Doug?
I mean, there's a reason we're making this a two-parter for our season, and it takes someone who is truly knowledgeable in the history of cable to be producing a podcast that documents the history of cable. We definitely learned so much from Doug, so let's get into that.
Yeah, I think the first insight is something we've talked a lot on the show, is this idea of knowing your audience and building a brand around them. We've talked about this with brand psychologists. We've talked about this when we talk about Apple and Nike or what have you. This idea that cable unlocked was finding an audience that was kind of just taking the products they had. Finding an audience that was watching ABC Family because that was just what was on. And creating a channel and a brand around them. The reason that is so important is because you're taking an audience that's okay with what they have and finding a way to connect with them deeper. For example, with MTV, they created this club around this age group and said, you could be watching ABC, but watch MTV, be a part of this. And because this was before DVR, before recording, before streaming, what have you, if you missed that night of MTV content, you're not going to be able to talk about it around the water cooler with the other people around your age. So by building this brand around this age group, they created this club and this kind of must-see TV mentality. So when you went to school the next day with that age group, they all talk about MTV. So it kind of pulls you into watching it. So one, it connects with you because it's talking about your issues, your problems, your things. You know that audience intimately. But two, it also creates this club that you have to be a part of. So that was really key about all storytelling and all brand development. Knowing your audience, creating a brand around them, and then doing whatever you can to super serve them, to know them so intimately that you give them stuff that's built for them that wouldn't work on any other network. It's not about creating the best TV show, it's about creating the MTV show. And what was really great and be ahead of its time with this was this allowed advertisers to connect with these audiences because they know these are the kids watching it. So they can create advertisements and products and things around those people and connect directly with them instead of putting it on ABC and hoping they see it. And we've seen this evolve so much as technology changes with TikTok, Meta, Google, Instagram, YouTube, all doing the same thing where they are serving you ads that feel like they're tailor-made for you. Like, I just bought something on TikTok this week and I'm like, wow, this is so me. Because these ads allow advertisers to target people exactly like you and sell to you. And that really was heavily done in cable because we were able to create these brands, these channels around the specific audience. Now we're able to target interest based on what you see. So cable did this amazing thing about knowing your brand, creating audiences around them, super serving them, and then giving advertisers the opportunity to connect with that brand, to connect with the exact same people and deploy their money more fluidly. So it's extremely exciting to go back and look at the birthplace of this kind of targeting mentality.
Definitely. And this was before the age of internet and social media. We now take targeted digital marketing for granted, but back then this dynamic of creative content and advertisement working together has definitely fueled the success of MTV and Comedy Central, but it also provided a great template for business models in the upcoming decades.
And it was really important with him too because they're super serving the audience. While so many types of shows and things were built to sell ads because they're like, we have this audience captivated, they remembered and understood that the only way they keep that audience captivated is to be intentional. So they have to do that balancing act, right? It's not just about selling the ads, selling the products, because if you take that cheap out, you can lose the trust of that audience. And when your channel is built around one audience, when your brand is built around one team, one audience, losing that trust is very dangerous. Because once you lose that trust, they could go somewhere else. They may never come back. So the importance of being intentional about that audience, super serving them, making sure you create content for them, and then using that audience to sell ads is a hugely important tool, because if you take advantage of that audience and focus on the merchandising of the ads, you're going to lose that audience, and then you have no value to sell back to the advertisers. I mean, I think a good example of this is what happened with Robinhood. Robinhood hit a huge problem when they lost the trust of their retail investors, because their brand was around their retail investors. And I'm not sure they've ever fully recovered from that. This is just one example of the modern day, but if you lose your trust in brands because you're too focused on the business model, you'll have nothing to sell for the business model. So the importance of putting your audience first is a key lesson of cable, because while shows were created to sell ads, they put their audience first, and they found a way to be intentional about that.
Yeah, and what I find interesting in the case of Comedy Central is when it came to South Park, advertisement actually kind of gives back and enabled the content itself, because it was a very risky thing to put a cartoon show that talks about much edgier topics than normal onto a cable TV channel. But there were advertisers who are willing to associate themselves with that brand and with that audience, and that gave South Park, or gave Comedy Central, the green light to bring South Park over to the channel. Honestly, that turned out to be a pretty successful show and pretty successful brand for a very long time.
Yeah, and we see this nowadays even with shows like Yellowstone. Yellowstone is a hugely successful show, and what that show did was it found an audience that wasn't being served. It found an audience that didn't have content made for them, and they were taking the other content. And that's the hugely important thing for any form of storytelling, any form of product building. Look for the audiences that aren't being served, that are taking the stuff that companies are putting out for mass and just taking it because that's all they have available. If you can give quality storytelling to an audience that's big enough, that's being underserved, that's your niche. That's how you build storytelling. That's how you build brands. You give them something they haven't seen before.
And that's ultimately the unique quality of cable as a storytelling medium, and the legacy it leaves to entertainment and storytelling is that it provides people with options to a more diverse range of topics, more diverse content that may speak to them better. Cable channels have the freedom to create their unique characters, to not become just another generic brand that appeals to everybody, and that ultimately serves the audience better. They have a more diverse stream of content that they can consume.
Yeah, the legacy of cable was choice. And I think when you think about that, you've seen that in so many other industries. You see this in social media with all the different apps that are available. You see this in retail now that there's so many direct-to-consumer brands. It's not just you go to one Walmart and you buy everything. Now there's 12 different places just to get your mattress, right? And you see how this idea, this legacy of cable, this idea of choice and finding your niche audience and super serving that audience has allowed platforms like TikTok to give advertisers a chance to target just the people they want. So you can have 12 mattress brands because they can target just the people who need mattresses, right? But I think no matter how personalized and how specific and specialized this world gets, there's a reason there are still blockbuster movies, and there's a reason there are still blockbuster shows, even though we all have immense access to content and just the things we love. There's a reason why a show like Succession connects with so many people, or why Marvel is huge in the box office. It's because there are still universal truths of storytelling. There are still abilities to create stories for mass people. There's abilities to create a very specific show like Schitt's Creek, but still have it appeal to a mass amount of people because of the universal truths of storytelling. And this is something we talk about a lot, that storytelling is a medium as old as time, right? It's something that's been passed down for generation and generation. There are still ways to connect with a mass amount of people with simple stories, even told in different ways. And we talked about this a lot with John Booker, about how societies that grew and evolved to be independent to each other had similar stories, like the Cinderella story, like the Going Home story. It's because as humans, we all go through the human experience, and that gives us access to stories that are related to us, no matter how different we are. So I think as we get excited about personalization, as we get excited about choice, as we get excited about all these new technologies, it's important to remember the basics of storytelling, and that's understanding the human experience and creating something that's going to connect with your audience.
And this has been another great episode of the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. If you like our content, make sure to subscribe and follow wherever you listen. Leave us a comment or review to let us know what you think of us so that we can make it better. Follow us on Instagram, TikTok at LSPTpod, LinkedIn, Linen Suit and Plastic Tie.
Thanks y'all for listening. We're here to help you become better storytellers, and we appreciate your time because we know there's so much content out there. We love you. Have an amazing day. Talk soon.